In this video, I want to address some of the other arguments against Thanksgiving. A couple weeks ago, I uploaded a video entitled, "Should Christians Observe or Celebrate Thanksgiving?" And I talked about the history of the Catholic Church conquering and colonizing. I talked about Christopher Columbus, whose voyage was funded by Queen Isabella, and it was backed by the Catholic Church because Spain was bankrupt. Now, Christopher Columbus has nothing to do with Thanksgiving, but I'm going to demonstrate for you here. I'm going to read from one of these arguments against Thanksgiving, and I'm going to demonstrate for you here that everything just becomes this jumble of history and how white people have always oppressed and white people have always made slaves, which is not true. That's not the history. These are politically based narratives. And God's people are not supposed to get tangled up in political correctness and the narratives of the world. So let's first look at what God established. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your the door frames of your houses and on your gates. The message here, it's to be a part of every single part of you and every single part of your life. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, a land with large flourishing cities you did not build. Listen, a land with large flourishing cities you did not build, houses with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So he's bringing them into a new land where they're going to plunder and they're going to take that land for themselves. I am the messenger. If this bothers you, you got to take it up with him. The issue that we need to be concerned with is the way that people like the Catholic Church have ruled brutally over people, because God also established that when you take slaves, you are to treat them with certain decent conduct. And he established that conduct throughout the Old Testament. The issue is not whether people are allowed to conquer other lands. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of land. So when the Catholic Church does things like this, when they conquered land and colonized, they imposed harsh taxes and burdens and forced religion and all of the things that they do today: murder, rape, pedophilia, etc. Is that what God established for his people? Absolutely not. Now, I'm not even saying that the Puritans who came over here from England, who were escaping religious persecution, and God gave them a land for them to be able to worship freely, I'm not even saying that they conquered that land. And by the way, neither can anyone else, because the history is so confused. And you're going to see that when I read this article. It is so confused. And so the thing that Native Americans are mourning right now, or not all of Native Americans, but many who are mourning right now, is the genocide of Native Americans. Well, I don't deny that that's happened. I don't deny that they have been treated brutally and harshly. But I do deny that that happened on Thanksgiving, because there's no clear evidence that it did. And certainly Abraham Lincoln did not institute Thanksgiving as a day of genocide. He instituted it as a day of thanksgiving. What are we giving thanks for? Well, let me ask you something. What were the Puritans giving thanks for? They were fasting and praying. That was their practice. to fast and pray. Not even really for this feast, right? They were giving thanks to God. They weren't celebrating murder. All right, so the article I'm going to read comes from delish.com. And I'm just going to read a portion of the article just because I want to demonstrate for you what the narrative is, that it's not clear. You probably have some vague idea that this Thanksgiving holiday is not quite the rosy picture you read about in school, but the real origins of the holiday are not clear-cut either. Well, thank you for admitting that up front. We'll give you the best glimpse at what we know, but note, there's a lot of information to digest about this issue and a few supposed origins of the holiday, some of them conflicting. This is the most commonly researched and reported story. According to the New York Times, the Mayflower did in fact bring settlers from England to land, which they colonized and renamed Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1621. Those pilgrims did hold a 3-day feast, which was attended by members of the Wampanoag tribe. However, typically when these settlers had what they referred to as Thanksgiving observances, they actually fasted. So this feast and celebration was known as a rejoicing, according to the New Yorker. With that in mind, this meal actually being viewed as the first Thanksgiving is up for debate with experts. I mean, do we really care about whether they ate or fasted? Personally, I don't care. I think it's actually more representative of this being a faith-based celebration. Don't mistake that for a holy day, but that this was a faith-based celebration in which they were giving thanks to God, what he had done for them, the persecution that they were fleeing. And by the way, how did a bunch of Puritans come and colonize Plymouth, Massachusetts? That was England that did that. Though there might have been turkey or some type of poultry served, there was no pie or mashed potatoes as we have today. Oh, the crime against humanity. They would have probably had seafood as well as a Wampanoag dish called nasamp, a porridge made of cornmeal, which the settlers had adopted. As the Smithsonian points out, discussions of this event are often centered around the settlers, but Native Americans had been on the island for centuries before, and the story from their perspective obviously far predates this feast. When Europeans began coming to what is now known as the United States about 4 years before the Mayflower arrived, they carried foreign illnesses which killed Native people at exceedingly high rates. I mean, people come into the United States and bring foreign illnesses all the time. That then made it easier for colonizers to take over these lands. Well, who were the colonizers? That's still not really clear to me. It's not really clear across all of the historical accounts who the colonizers were and who was taking them as slaves. For sure, Christopher Columbus was taking them as slaves in 1492, and we're talking about the 1600s. There's also the fact that settlers came to the land to kidnap and sell Native Americans into slavery. Again, Christopher Columbus was doing that in the 15th century. Thanksgiving did not happen until the 17th century. Two totally different events. The other issue is, are they taking them, how are they ruling over them? Because it's not against what God has established to have slaves, to conquer a territory, for his people to be given a land that you heard what I read, that contains cities they did not build, good things they did not provide, wells they did not dig, vineyards and olive groves they did not plant. And what does he say? When you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And so to observe a day in which people are thanking him for doing that is not bad. But look what the world has to say about it. That's what's in my heart with regard to observing Thanksgiving. For me, it is a recognition of God giving land to his people to escape persecution. If anyone ruled over anyone harshly, that is not something that I am celebrating. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to celebrate what God gave his people. So there's also the fact that settlers came to the land to kidnap and sell Native Americans into slavery. Again, I have to ask the question, who did that? And the historical account is not clear about who did that. Were those English settlers who were coming here to escape religious persecution, to worship freely, who were rejoicing and fasting and praying? Did they rule over them harshly? But now listen to the next thing that's written. The newly settled Europeans also did not invite the Native Americans to their feast. Usamakin, leader of the Wampanoag tribe, had declared an alliance with the settlers, and members of the tribe were showing up to honor a mutual defense pact. They'd heard the Pilgrims shooting their guns in celebration and thought they were in combat. After some talk, they decided to spend 3 days together and join the feast. But this type of coming together did not become a warm, fuzzy tradition, as you may have been taught in school. That's inconsequential. They felt comfortable enough to make a pact. Who gives a hoot about the tradition? The point is, we're looking at history. We're looking at the fact that Native Americans felt comfortable enough with these settlers to make a pact with them. The settlers didn't just go in on them, and they decided. They weren't coerced. They decided in and of their own accord. So they must have felt comfortable enough to spend 3 days together and join the feast. From then on, Pilgrims celebrated Thanksgiving in their traditional way of fasting and praying, according to the New Yorker. Several times this happened because of the massacres of Native people. Oh, I see. Okay, so now we're bringing in other historical accounts of massacre. That's not Thanksgiving. If something else occurred before the fact with Christopher Columbus or after the fact with Governor John Winthrop, that has nothing to do with this Thanksgiving tradition. No, it is not a holy day. However, we are allowed to observe special days. In the Bible, Job's children observed their birthdays. That's a special day, but it's not a holy day. So several times this happened because of the massacres of Native people, including in 1637 when Massachusetts colony Governor John Winthrop declared a day of Thanksgiving after volunteers murdered 700 Pequot people. This incident is also often cited as the first official mention of a Thanksgiving ceremony and is another commonly cited origin story for the Thanksgiving we know today. Well, I've never heard it, and as far as what I'm seeing in my research, everything is dependent upon the historian. And as political propaganda and race propaganda continue to rise, the story begins to change. Various dates of the modern-day Thanksgiving holiday has been declared since then and were celebrated by individual states, but it wasn't until 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln declared the last Thursday in November as a day of Thanksgiving, and the holiday as we know it stuck. Why is Thanksgiving still controversial? The atrocities against Native Americans did not end with the diseases or massacres mentioned above. So seeing people celebrating the positive myth around Thanksgiving can be frustrating and painful for many, especially indigenous people. Combine that with the fact that some non-natives chose to dress up in things like headdresses in honor of Thanksgiving, which many see as a mockery of sacred dress. Look, no one is celebrating the massacre of anybody. The historical account is not even clear. It's convoluted, and it has been retold according to political propaganda of the time. And I personally find it grievous and offensive to me as a Christian that people are coming against a holiday that represents separation from the oppression of the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and those that bore out of her. Why do you think the world keeps coming against this holiday? This is a holiday commemorating freedom from religious oppression, land that was given to God's people so that they could worship freely and they could flourish and they could be blessed, which is exactly what has happened in America until we turned away from him. The evidence of what God has done is in the fruit. If he's blessed this nation, then that's all the evidence that I need to understand that he set apart a nation of all skin colors, of all races, and there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, and certainly he does not delineate based on race. It could have just as easily been anybody else persecuting white people. But as it is, God allowed those who were worshiping him, who wanted to worship him freely and came to this country to do so, giving up their homes and all they had. And I'm going to celebrate that. Does that mean I'm celebrating a massacre? Absolutely not. It's not even clear in history whether that massacre had anything to do with the people who came here to worship freely, who came here fleeing that oppression. Furthermore, this is happening in the 17th century. By the 18th century, who colonized the Americas? The Pilgrims on the Mayflower didn't have the power to colonize. By 1776, when we declared independence, we were declaring independence from Britain. They were the power. So these historical accounts don't even make sense. Certainly, God's people are allowed to conquer, but it doesn't even make sense that God's people were actually doing that because they wouldn't have had that kind of power. And as it is, by 1776, we were still trying to break free of Britain, still trying to break free of that influence that continued to follow around and attempt to oppress God's people. Does that not make better sense than this jumble of different historical accounts that derive out of political propaganda? If people want to mourn what has been done, then mourn what's been done. But I, for one, am tired of being a scapegoat for people's race propaganda. It's satanic. It's a distraction. Most of the time, it's not accurate. And frankly, this is something we have to take up with God. Not only that, but if we're not treating others in this way, then why are the sins of our ancestors being placed on this current generation? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm not going to go along with this imposition of guilt because I don't bear that guilt. That is not my guilt to bear. Nor is this recounting of history being told correctly because it's not adding up. The rest of the picture is not adding up. I hope you'll think about these things because you need to understand that this race propaganda is now being combined with white Christians. Are white people the only Christians? I mean, that doesn't even add up, does it? This is culminating to a narrative that is going to come against Christians. You have to understand that. And so if you're going along with these ridiculous narratives, you are participating in the problem. You need to understand that you are setting yourself up through a guilt that doesn't even belong to you, in a narrative that's not even biblical. In fact, it's anti-biblical. So please consider the way that you're being swayed by the world's propaganda. This is not anywhere congruent with the Word of God. You need to consider who were the powers at the time. A group of people coming over on a boat was not the power at the time. You need to consider also, what has God established? Has He told His people that they can plunder so that if they did, if that part of the story is even true, which I don't believe that it is because there's no evidence for it. The evidence is that they had a pact and they were living in harmony. If more people from England came over and exploited and saw an opportunity, which is every indication because by 1776, we were living under the oppression of England. If that's what happened, why are we now distorting and defiling an observance of Thanksgiving that was lifted up to God? To the one God, by the way, not to the pagan gods that were being worshipped here. Do you think that God might have allowed His people to come to this land? And that if they did conquer, that maybe we should consider what He was doing rather than leaning on our own understanding? If all this political propaganda had the Spirit of God behind it, we should be living in harmony by now, shouldn't we? Rather than continually setting up this situation where there's victim and perpetrator hundreds of years later. You think that's empowering to anyone? It certainly hasn't proven to be empowering. It continues to be a story of disempowerment and manipulation of those who are being disempowered. We're supposed to be considering what God is doing in every single situation. And I don't see that the people of God are actually doing that. What I see is that they defer to the narrative. They defer to the world's narrative and the world to tell them what truth is. And then they go along with it and they say, well, yeah, it's not in God's word, but just in case. Just in case what? Just in case you're too lazy to sit in the counsel of God? Just in case you're too lazy to read the word of God and see what He established? Just in case you're too lazy to consider what He might have been doing in a given situation? Just in case you're not willing to think for yourself and you want someone else to tell you what to think? because that's why we are where we are. God's people don't stand for anything. God's people reject the spirit that he's given them in order to counsel them and tell them what truth is. It's too difficult for God's people to look at what he's established in the world. It's too hard for me to wrap my brain around that. That's why we are where we are. I live in a country and a land that God established and set apart for his people of all nations, tribes, languages, and peoples to come and worship him freely. Be the light of the world to others who don't have that light yet, like the natives, like the indigenous people who were here. That's the land I live in, and that land has been defiled because God's people are not standing. They don't stand for anything. They go along with these stories, don't bear the fruit of God. They bear the fruit of the devil. They create dissension and disempowerment, set people against each other rather than bringing the unity that God prayed for in the Garden of Gethsemane with his people, with his church. And now my religious freedom and my freedom to speak the truth is slowly being taken away. I'm going to celebrate this holiday. I'm going to remember what God did. I'm not going to feel ashamed for shame that is not mine. I'm going to speak the truth as long as I'm allowed to speak it. And I'm going to give thanks to God for what he's done. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.